I worked just shy of 40 years, but my pension still wasn't going to be enough for us. So when he called out of the blue, offering a free pension review, I was all ears. He spoke professionally about investments. He seemed a really decent guy. Just shy of 40 years pension. He took all of it.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Oldie podcast. I'm Ferdie Rous, the Oldie's editorial assistant. Today we welcome author, commentator and Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens, whose new book, The Phoney Victory, The World War II Delusion, challenges some of our most deeply held beliefs about the Second World War, which began 80 years ago this month. So Peter, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So if I can jump straight in, why did you write the book?
Because I was sick of this country going to war by choice on false pretexts. I first of all examined the false pretexts, such as in Kosovo and Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, and then I found repeatedly that they referred to a view of how the Second World War had broken out and why it had broken out and what it was about. And then I found, when I examined that view, that it didn't actually stand up to examination. That what people think about how the Second World War started and why it was fought and what it was for is incorrect.
So was there a particular moment when you sort of first identified that there was a myth?
I think we've all known there was a bit of a myth about it, really, since childhood in my case, because it was so overdone, the glorification of it, and also because those of us like me who grew up in the immediate aftermath of the war were very conscious of the fact that despite supposedly having been the glorious victors in this great conflict, the country looked pretty battered and shabby. And the people who'd fought in it didn't seem to me to have the air of warriors returning triumphant from the fray, who believed that they'd got the victory they hoped for. There was an air of slight disappointment in the country in the 50s that I think hinted, even to those of us for whom childhood games and almost everything we read was centred on the war, it wasn't quite as great as we had been led to believe that it was. So I had a suspicion since childhood, and my own father would occasionally say, later on in the evening usually, that he would be discussing and say, well, we won the war, and then he'd say, or did we? Military tone, which suggested he wasn't at all sure that we had. And since he'd been in it, I rather thought he should know. And the doubt was there, just waiting really to be examined. Mm-hmm.
So as you were saying, sort of 50s and 60s, you had that the propaganda offensive of all the great sort of war films and all of this and that, and it's entertaining. It's interesting to see that they actually, all appear on the Sundays as if they are a religion in themselves.
Well, a lot of them were very good films. I think the Cruel Sea, Nicholas Montserrat's book, is a very good book and a very good film. And the interesting thing about it is how very truthful it is. And when you watch it as an adult, as opposed to or read it as opposed to the way you read it as a child, you see just how much truth he tells about the real horror and pity of war. It's one of the most savagely graphic descriptions of how terrible war can be, and even in that film, which is largely regarded as patriotic, almost war propaganda, there is a terrible business where HMS Compass Rose steers directly through a group of drowning sailors and drops depth charges in the middle of them because the captain believes there's a submarine beneath, and it's an appalling scene of the ruthlessness of war, and there it is again. We knew it; it was all lying around waiting. And my father again was at the sinking of the Scharnhorst in 1943, and he had a card which had been signed by all the survivors they picked up of a ship's company of something in the region of I'm doing this from memory, probably 1,500 men. I think they only picked up a couple of dozen in the end. And everybody knew that this was a shocking thing, but the general rule was, in the freezing waters of the Arctic, people would probably be dead in less than 2 minutes, and that you couldn't hang around in case there were submarines around who were waiting to sink you, in which case you'd be the one struggling in the freezing water. So people were just left to die in quite shockingly large numbers.
Do you think at all that the myth, as it were, the myth surrounding our power and our prestige, were they there before the war even started?
I think there had been a myth about our importance really since the First World War, which is when we, in my view, committed national suicide by for some reason still completely invisible to me, decided to join in a Russo-German European war and bankrupted ourselves with amazing speed. We were a pensioner of the United States by 1916 and organised the slaughter of the flower of our manhood, a thing from which we've never recovered morally, politically or economically. And I think from then on, really, we were living in a fool's paradise of imagined greatness. And the period between the two wars was such a period of illusion. And there's a very good passage from Louis Le Bailey's memoirs of his time as an engineering officer in the Royal Navy of how the great ships were really whited sepulchres. They looked magnificent as they moored and set out their awnings and held cocktail parties and trained their enormous guns, but actually they were barely able to shoot because the gun mountings were corroded and the engines were outdated and the ships themselves were nothing like as good as they looked. And it was the same. The British Empire was nothing like as good as it looked. It was a shell, but it wasn't anything like as obvious in the 1920s and 1930s as it later became.
Mm-hmm. Go to more specifically on the war itself. Wodehouse is a bit of an oldie favourite. I've got to bring him up. Why did he get it in the neck when not many others did in the same way? I mean, Chaplin didn't, for instance.
Oh, I think he got it in the neck because Duff Cooper decided to give it to him in the neck. I think it was an accident in which he got caught in the gun sights of a man who I think has been rather overrated by history as a figure in British politics, who didn't have enough of a sense of humour or tolerance or proportion to realise that what Wodehouse was doing when he was interned was never intended to damage his country or his people. It would never have crossed Wodehouse's mind to do that. The worst offence he ever committed was one of naivety. He was an unworldly person, and for Duff Cooper, who was a worldly person and a person with a terrible temper as well, to decide to try and make a scapegoat or an example of him was I'm afraid rather typical of Duff Cooper. And if one were looking back over that period and had to choose between Duff Cooper and Plum Wodehouse as to which one preferred, I don't have difficulty in working out which.
And on topic of sort of Cooper and the cabinet, do you very much get the impression that, I mean, they entirely caused their own issues, really? The Halifax, for instance, constructed the war and then panicked. Is that about right?
Well, that is the view which I have come to, having read in detail about the Polish guarantee, which is a fascinating and largely unexamined area of British diplomatic history. And people often wonder, how did we get from the slavish, grovelling appeasements, supposedly, of 1938 to the majestic, warlike courage and stoicism of September 1939, and then how did we get from the long months of the supposedly phony war, in which we absolutely did nothing to help Poland, which we guaranteed, to the finest hour? And the truth is that these are all misrepresentations of what actually happened. First of all, our action over Czechoslovakia was something of which we didn't really have much choice. Once Germany had absorbed Austria, Czechoslovakia was indefensible. People go on and on about the Czech defences in the Erzgebirge and the Czech Maginot Line and the Czech army and all the rest of it. But you can do it now. I've done it. A lot of people don't know any Eastern European geography, but here is an interesting fact. Prague is west of Vienna. If you travel overland from Prague to Vienna, you run into the flat lands where Austria, what is currently Austria and was then the Third Reich, borders what was then Czechoslovakia, and it's plainly indefensible town country. Mm-hmm. So the idea that somehow or other they were going to come over the mountains when they could have come over flat land, and the idea that there would be any difficulty given that Germany had air bases all around Czechoslovakia in attacking and destroying any defence that was put up is absurd. They would have lost, and we would have probably lost with them. We were even more badly prepared militarily in 1938 than we were in 1939. The guarantee to Poland, it was excoriated at the time by Churchill as a fairly ludicrous act. And it was an empty thing. We all knew, all the politicians who gave it, and the military chiefs who were told about it, knew perfectly well that nothing would be done if Poland were attacked. And the agreement eventually contained this secret clause in which we actually said that if Poland was attacked by the Soviet Union, it didn't say it quite as explicitly as that, but it's open to no other interpretation. If Poland was attacked by the Soviet Union, then we would do nothing. It only triggered action in the event of an attack from Germany. Perhaps an actual alliance joining the Nazi, the anti-Comintern pact, but certainly neutralising Poland as a potential ally for the future for Britain and France, and leaving us actually with no point at which we could assert our power and influence in Europe. If the Poles had come to an agreement with Germany, what was the point at which we would then have had an excuse or pretext or reason, whatever you care to call it, to declare war on Germany? There is no obvious point at which it would have come. The other thing is that you have to remember is that all this happened before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Britain and France both believed that they could rerun 1918 and starve Germany into submission by a naval blockade. But of course the Nazi-Soviet pact made that impossible. Immediately Hitler was able to supply himself from the east, and also didn't have to worry about a two-front war. And it's quite astonishing that even at that stage, on August the 23rd, I think it was, when the pact was signed and it became clear it happened, that was the moment at which the Anglo-French strategy of the Polish guarantee fell into ruins. And in the very short time remaining, it doesn't seem to occur to anybody that it would be unwise to proceed on the previous basis. So we went ahead and declared war in support of Poland and began the war, which, if you take the Second World War as being more than one war, which I do, I think there's the first war between Britain, France and Germany, and then there's the later war between the Soviet Union and the United States and Germany. And that war, the Anglo-French war against Germany, ended in defeat in June 1940. France was defeated and occupied, Britain was defeated and not occupied.
You mentioned a moment ago that Poland would have come to terms with Germany. It's not something that occurs to anyone. I mean, not that occurs to many people.
It should, because there'd been an awful... One of the first countries to sign any kind of diplomatic agreement with the Third Reich had been Poland, which signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1934.
But sort of the myth image of it is a sort of...
Yeah, Poland, we all have enormous respect for the Polish airmen who came and fought in the Battle of Britain, and everybody has terrible sympathy for the Poles having been wiped off the map. But Poland, as a country and a government in the late 1930s, was not a particularly beautiful example of the democratic loveliness. It was, although this wasn't reflected in law, it was in practice a deeply anti-Semitic country whose elite very much disliked having so many Jews within their borders, and it was a military despotism. I think it had been since, 1928, and there'd been a purge. And it had also taken part in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia after Munich. The Poles, encouraged by Germany, had seized the Teschen area on the Czech border, which they had long coveted, and took the opportunity to take. So here you have an aggressive, anti-Semitic military despotism. You could hardly say it's a huge act of democratic principle and defence of freedom to say it's also... Anglo-French diplomacy, going back to the Locarno treaties of 1925, had said long before Hitler came to power, when Germany was still a democratic republic, and a proper democratic republic, had said that the issue of the eastern frontiers of Germany was open. And there'd been a lot of sympathy, particularly in Britain, less so in France, to German views that they'd been mistreated at Versailles and that the borders were all wrong. It was absurd, for instance, that what was then Danzig, a wholly German city, was separated from Germany. And the Silesian plebiscite over which bits of of Germany were given to Poland had plainly not been conducted in a straight fashion. Germany had many legitimate grievances, and if it hadn't been the Nazi Third Reich, people would have been more sympathetic to them, and had been more sympathetic to them before 1933. The case, the simple international diplomatic case, was for some sort of rearrangement of the German-Polish border was actually not all that bad. Certainly a good deal. Germany had a much stronger case over Poland than it had over the Sudetenland, over which we'd given in. So it's odd. It's if you examine it, it's very hard to find a uniting principle except Halifax's belief that we had to do something, the old something must be done problem.
It's a very dangerous slogan, that.
A very dangerous slogan, and also the very strong belief, particularly in the Foreign Office, and I think very much held by Halifax and to a lesser extent by Chamberlain, that we had to, and France also had to, assert its position as a great European power. And that at some point or other something had to be done about German expansion and German muscle flexing, and this was it. And if there hadn't been the Nazi-Soviet pact, it might well have worked. There might have been a long Sitzkrieg of no great conflict, during which we slowly strangled Germany and the Hitler regime fell. There's no real way of examining this now, because it didn't. But as soon as Ribbentrop signed that agreement in the Kremlin, all that was out of the window, and there wasn't any future in it. And yet we continued with the policy, not really having any idea what to do next.
Mm-hmm. To go from sort of Poland, and just one of the later also big, one of the sort of large ones, is about just the myth, the idea of Bomber Harris, sort of the justification for the ruthless bombing campaigns. Was he a scapegoat at all?
Well, you have to give Harris some respect. He never ever made any attempt to pretend he was doing anything other than what he was doing. He was once stopped by a traffic policeman, and while driving late in the lanes near Bomber Command headquarters one night, and the traffic policeman said, "Well, I'm sorry, sir, but if you drive like that, you're going to kill somebody." And Harris said, "Young man, I kill thousands of people every week." And there are, in the book, I record several statements, speeches, and other recorded material in which RAF and other people connected with the bombing campaign openly admit to the nature of it, that it was a deliberate attempt to kill German civilians in their homes, and also it was targeted because bombing is much more efficient. If you want to kill people, it's much more efficient on crowded, poor areas, targeting the working class areas of German cities inhabited by the Social Democrats and Communists who'd voted against Hitler to the last. So the idea, and indeed they're women and children and babies who cannot by any stretch be made responsible for the regime. So there is no moral case for this at all. But we continue to pretend that there is. First of all, it saved us from invasion, which it didn't, because there was never going to be an invasion. Here is the fact that astonishes most people. The Germans never at any stage built any landing craft. The supposed Sea Lion invasion plans in 1940 never got off the drawing board, and were only maintained as a propaganda fiction to try and scare us into making peace. By the time we got going with our major bombing offensive, which is really end of 42, 43, Germany had turned eastwards, and there was they had no interest in invading us, even if they wanted to. And in terms of winning the war, again, by the time the bombing had really got into its full fury in late 43, 44, the tide of war had already turned after Stalingrad and Kursk, and it didn't actually make any difference. The only argument for it is that, of course, it did divert fighter planes and artillery away from the Eastern Front. But the same thing could have been achieved by accurate bombing under heavy fighter escort by day of real military targets, which, when it was ultimately done in the later stages of the war, was enormously and very rapidly effective in destroying German war-making capacity. Whereas the bombing of civilians, as well as being hideous and cruel, was astonishingly ineffective.
It was sanctioned by the highest levels.
Oh, completely. Harris made absolutely sure he had a document which he regarded as the RAF's charter to bomb, and he knew that the politicians, particularly Churchill, would later on have qualms about what they were doing, and he made sure he had that. and there's no question of it. But it's simply this isn't a defence of Harris, because he was very he was very determined to continue on this policy of bombing civilians in their homes. That was what he wanted to do, and resisted before D-Day, for instance, quite strongly efforts made to get him to turn his efforts elsewhere. And he was also not particularly sympathetic to pleas to use more planes against German submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic, where their absence was often crucial and made that battle a lot closer than it needed to be. So this is a defence of Harris, but there's no question he was honest about what he was doing, whereas the politicians generally were not. And in subsequent years, there's been an attempt to pretend that the bombing of civilians in Germany was not that, it didn't have that purpose, it wasn't as bad as we think it was, or it was justified by military necessity, and these things are not true. When the bombing surveys were done by the United States and Britain at the end of the war on the actual damage to Germany, it was perfectly plain that the war had not had remotely the effect on the German war effort that had been claimed by Harris and his supporters.
Sure. So with this sort of just think about more the end of the war and sort of the immediate aftermath, did only beaten powers learn from it? Learn the lessons? I mean...
Oh, I think Germany learnt an enormous lesson. I'm sure Japan did as well. It's in a way less significant to us. Japan underwent the most terrible misery as a result of being defeated. But I've no doubt at all that Japan's turn towards semi-pacifist democracy and as were international passivity has been a direct result of what happened. In Germany, I'm likewise certain that the turn towards the building of the European Union and of finding a way of containing the inevitable domination of Western Europe by Germany in a peaceful form has been a result of the war. It's plainly stupid for anybody to risk anything of that kind again. So I'm sure that the political class of Germany and of Japan learned very important lessons from it. Beyond doubt. But I'm not quite sure where that comes into my thesis.
I was thinking more about the quite interesting episode you mentioned in Dresden, I think it was a few years ago, where neo-Nazis tried to claim that. I was thinking in terms of that specifically, where. Well,
I think what anybody who criticises the British and the American bombing of Germany tends to be accused of equating it with the mass murder of German Jews, right, which is a slander. I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. The massacre of European Jews was a crime unique in its scale and horror, and there's nothing whatever which measures up to it. But just because somebody else has done something absolutely appallingly bad, off the scale in wickedness, doesn't mean that you are licensed to commit less wicked acts on your own side. And it's an absurdity which often comes up in discussion in the Second World War. The same thing happens in discussion of the Potsdam Agreement and the mass ethnic cleansing of Germans out of Central Europe after 1945, which is a blot frankly on the record of the human race. It was terrible, but it can't be equated with the Holocaust. But so what? That the Holocaust is not, just because the Holocaust was extraordinarily bad, it doesn't mean that other actions which were not as bad are excusable. It's a weird argument to suggest that it's so, but this accusation which is levelled against critics of the bombing, or indeed of the Potsdam expulsions, this accusation which is levelled against critics of the bombing and the Potsdam expulsions, does seem to me to have the implication in it that those of us who are doing it are in some way trying to offer a defence of Germany and its behaviour, which I'm absolutely not, and I have to be very emphatic about that, and also very emphatic about the fact that I'm absolutely not saying that Britain should have made peace with Germany in 1940, because I believe that Winston Churchill's refusal to do so was his principal contribution to human history and the best thing he ever did. But I'm not saying that. But the moment you raise the subjects which I raise in my book, you are immediately numbered with the transgressors by people who can't understand that anybody can be critical of the Second World War without immediately collapsing into some sort of Nazi apologism or pacifism. I do neither. I very much believe the war should have been fought. I'm very much not a pacifist, and I am as appalled by and as undoubting about the nature of the Holocaust as any other person.
It's just intriguing. You get sort of comments like Clement Attlee's comment about Potsdam Agreement, or anything which reminds the Germans of their defeat. So there's a sort of way that because maybe it was an ideas war. Yeah.
I think that there is. I think people often say things of great ruthlessness.
Yes, I have thought.
I
thought that. Because it's
I think people.
Yes, 17 years. Yes, 17 years that I have promised with that man.
I think people often say, particularly often quite pacific, gentle people, often say things with great ruthlessness at times like this, in a sort of explosion of fake machismo to make themselves seem tough to themselves and to their audiences. And therefore they say things which they don't really mean, and which if they consider them in later life they come to regret. And I think an awful lot of statements of this kind, ultra-militant statements about how they deserved it and they need to be taught a lesson, are things which the people who make them probably don't really mean and later come to regret, especially when they see in detail and directly, which too few, I suppose, in a way do, the actual outcomes of what it is that they've been trying to defend.
You mentioned the EU sort of a bit earlier on. You describe it in the book, our entrance into the EU in the book, as not being the act of a victorious power. So why did we join it?
Well, no, it isn't the act of victorious power. I mean, the book, despite the efforts of Sir Richard Evans to claim that this is not a Eurosceptic book, it has very little to do with the subject indeed. And also, despite the claims of Sir Richard Evans, it wasn't an attempt to suck up to what he recently celebrated his 71st birthday, described as the elderly readers of my newspaper. It's the Britain's entry into the European Union was actually, in my view, prompted by our defeat at Suez, more than anything else. But the defeat at Suez brought home to us the true nature of our status after 1945. Between 1945 and 1956, a lot of British people still believed we were a first-class power. We still had much more substantial armed forces, we were still developing nuclear weapons. We were still, I think, on occasion, right up to the Test Ban Treaty of 1963, often present at major summits, which, as if we were still one of the big three at Yalta or whoever it is. And that illusion persisted. The defeat at Suez, which was both a diplomatic and a military defeat and a public humiliation by the Americans, persuaded an awful lot of people in the British elite that we really needed to seek sanctuary in some sort of other form of power where we could maintain some sort of status. And I think the idea of joining what was then the European Community, European Economic Community, I think it was technically termed at the time, appealed to people such as Harold Macmillan, who felt that that's what we should do to maintain ourselves as a major nation on the world stage. And I don't think it would have occurred to anybody to join such a body, particularly as they knew that it was a major sacrifice of sovereignty to join it, unless we felt deep in our hearts that we'd been defeated and diminished.
So if you don't want to segue on to some of your late brother, something which has been Brother Christopher, did you, and is it true that you had a treaty to end hostilities between the two of you when you were younger?
It was a very short-lived treaty. My father drew it up and got us to sign it and framed it in a little red frame on the wall. And after about, I would think, less than a week, I removed it from the wall, peeled off the back, and erased my signature, which I felt had been obtained under duress anyway, and withdrew my consent to it. It was called the Treaty of Cedarwood, because of the name of the house where we then lived. I so wish I'd preserved it. I don't know where it is now. My father kept it with my erased signature on it. I mean, you could see where I rubbed it out.
So, is there a particular reason for it in the first place? Or was it just brothers being brothers?
Because he didn't abide by so I wasn't going to either.
No, fair play. So what I wonder is that I wouldn't want to piece of Oldie to say you had similar journeys, but you were both Trotskyists. Did that have any sort of reconciliation
I was
effect?
Trotskyist partly because he was a Trotskyist. I mean, it was an appealing thing to be. He had gone off out into the world before I did, being 2.5 years older than I, and he'd come back with his political interests, which I found quite persuasive. This began, right, he'd gone away to the Lee School in Cambridge, would have been in 62, I think, and nothing much happened. Then after 2 years, the 1964 election, he stood as the Labour candidate in the school election. And he was politicised and came back full of political fervour, which communicated itself to me because enthusiasm and commitment do. It's carried on, and when he found his way into the International Socialists, I followed him there. But I was a different kind of Trotskyist from him. I was much more of a go out in the early morning to leaflet the factory sort of Trotskyist than he ever was, for instance. Can't really imagine Christopher getting up early in the morning to go and leaflet a factory. He might have stayed up all night and done it, but got up early in the morning.
And on to a less sort of cheerful note, it's obviously your relationship is quite fairly sort of widely publicised.
Incessantly.
I mean, and of course, but sort of
great stimulus to the national merriment, I think.
always tried to stoke it up. I think
one of those little melodramas that gave life a little bit more spice than otherwise. People enjoyed believing that it was more,
sort of the debates,
more significant than perhaps.
Sort of the joint TV debates were always.
We only did 2 full dress debates in our lives, and I think it pretty much comes out of 1 all. And there was a disastrous BBC Question Time where we were both on, and so was our old Boris Johnson, and there were just too many egos in the room. It didn't actually work. If Johnson hadn't been there, we'd have had a lot more fun, but the 3 of us in the same place was impossible. And they weren't really confrontations. The American channel C-SPAN would invite us both on when I lived in Washington from time to time, but they were hardly confrontations.
Yeah. Were you able to reconcile with Christopher in the end?
Well, I had no problem reconciling. I'm a great reconciler. I can't keep quarrels up. I get bored, but he bears a much bigger grudge than I. No, in the end, he was persuaded. Whether it was by somebody he met at some meeting or people who wrote to him at Vanity Fair that he should make up the quarrels. So he did. I mean, it was never. He loved quarrels. I would say about this, he actually managed to have a serious quarrel and go on non-speakers with James Fenton, who is probably the nicest person in the world, almost impossible to quarrel with. You know, James is a very fine poet, and he did that over the Falklands War, I seem to remember, because he liked having these quarrels. And there it is. But when he chose to end it, I was only too happy to end it. It had never really been about anything in the first place, anyway, in my view. Mm-hmm. Well, quite a funny thing, the thing that he claimed to have been mortally offended over was rather amusing. I discovered later I'd forgotten this had happened, something which I'd also chided him with during one of those C-SPAN discussions. And the first time, it was just reminding him that during the Reagan period of the Cold War, he once said that he didn't care if the Red Army watered its horses in Hendon. And I said this, and he just laughed. But when I then said it again in 2001, he had this absolute 150 megaton explosion of wrath.
But to slightly see your wider work in relation to this latest book, your other books, from The Abolition of Britain to The Rage Against God, there's a strong theme of decline in there.
Why might that be?
Wouldn't mind me
why would a
characterising it as
British
such.
author writing in this period of our history speak of decline?
I leave that to you.
It reminds me of the heckler confronting Harold Wilson when he was on a visit to Chatham in 1964 in the election when it was still a major naval base. And Wilson said, "And why do I stress the importance of Chatham?" Sorry, I messed that up. And Wilson said, "And why do I stress the importance of the Royal Navy?" And the heckler said, "Because you're in Chatham." Well, I write about decline because we're in decline.
But what I was wondering is this sort of latest book, is it meant to be sort of a starting point? This is the beginning of the decline, or was it sort of...
Beginning of the decline, I would always put 1914.
Put in? Okay.
There are better men than I have written histories about the outbreak of war in 1914, and better women as well, in the case of Barbara Tubman, who explain the ludicrousness of our decision to go to war at that point, and the futility, and also the dishonesty of the justifications we came up for it. But it doesn't take any kind of genius to see what happened to Britain as a result of it. The really great, amazingly, when the centenary books about the First World War came out, everybody went on and on about what always seemed to me to be a rather unexceptional book by Christopher Clark called The Sleepwalkers. The really great book about the First World War, the centenary book, was The Deluge by Alan Tooze, which is fantastic. It's full of new stuff, and it also sets the First World War in context and involves the United States, and particularly the Eastern Front and the extraordinary events in Russia and the Peace of Brest-Litovsk and the intervention of Germany in Russia. The fact that the Russian Revolution was no such thing. It was a bought and paid for putsch arranged by the German General Staff, which overthrew the first democracy Russia had ever had, and people still treat it as if it was a genuine popular uprising. Rubbish. Tooze's account of the East, and also of Germany's policy in the East of putting a bomb under the Russian Empire by offering a sort of pseudo-sovereignty to former Russian provinces, which pretty much remains the policy of the European Union in that part of the world now. It's brilliant. Tooze is the most wonderful historian, and it's a marvellous book, and it influenced me a great deal in the writing of the Phoney Victory.
Can we expect a book on the First World War?
The work on the First World War has been done.
No,
I think it's been said, and it's all there for people who want it. It's implied in everything I say, and if people ask me again, as you just did, what is the point at which we began our absolute precipitate national decline? August the 4th, 1914, that was the beginning of it. Leaving the gardens tidy, as Philip Larkin noted.
I think on that cheerful note, I think time to end our podcast. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.